Okay.
Okay, thank you for having me. My name is Dave Disler, and I'm the author of a couple of books on Long Lake that I've put together over the last 2 years. A little about my background is I was living in Cleveland at the time and had bought some property um, up north and was going to basically rehab it and rejuvenate it and use it as a retirement place, which is what I did. I bought it in 2017, spent about 4 years as a weekend warrior with my wife, and we rehabbed the place, remodeled it, and got it ready. And I really didn't know anything about the Alpena area or Northeast Michigan. My idea of up north when I lived in Indianapolis was going up to northern Minnesota or to northern Wisconsin. I knew very little about, for some reason, knew very little about Michigan. I was pleasantly surprised and fell in love with the place. So I have a place up off of Schubert Highway on the north side of Long Lake, and other parts of the year, I'm down in Indianapolis now. So I moved from Cleveland back to Indianapolis. Once I started being involved in the lake and talking to the community, I started realizing that there was a lot of history about the area in Northeast Ohio. I had gone to a bookstore and picked up a book by Janet Young. It was about Grand Lake, and I knew Grand Lake was just north of my place there, off of Schubert. And the book that I picked up was called Vintage Resorts of Grand Lake. And I picked one up, a used copy in a library, read all about it and thought, well, that's great. A lot of good history. I love history. So a lot of good history involved in writing the book. And I said, well, I'll have to go to the library and pick up a book on Long Lake. Well, it didn't take long for me to realize that there was no such book that I could find anyway, that had to do with, the history and the settling of Long Lake per se. And I was a little surprised by that, but the more I checked into it, the more I sort of realized that, well, Long Lake was fairly close to Alpena. Alpena is sitting on the big lake, Lake Huron. Part of Long Lake is in Presque Isle County, part of it is in Alpena County. And I just sort of think it may have gotten lost in the shuffle, so to speak. But at one time, it had a tremendous amount of history, and the settling of Long Lake is quite colorful. This is what you're seeing on screen right now is the front cover of the second volume that I had put together. And it shows either their advertising, some of their old postcards about Long Lake. And there's just a whole collage here of about 50 different pictures. When I started studying the Long Lake timelines, I kind of divided it up into 4 different eras that jumped out at me. The pre-1880 was obviously when they were doing the lumbering and basically stripping the land and taking it back down to just dirt. That left a lot of homesteading and farming that was developing around the Long Lake. So what I'm going to sort of say is anything before about 1880 is what I would call the homestead and farming era. And they really started developing up there. Let's see, the lumbering came in the 1850s. They were done pretty much by the 1870s or slightly thereafter. But then in 1880, something happened that is called the Victorian Resort Era. And I'll describe that in a little bit about really what that meant. And it lasted for about 40 or 50 years. It started in 1881 and wound up around the time of the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, up to modern times is what the mom and pop cottage area is around the lake. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then once it gets past the mom and pop cottage era, the present situation is most of the places are privatized, and there's very little evidence of the original places that are still left around the lake, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. If I take a look at some writings back in 1883, specifically the Lake Huron, the history of Lake Huron shore, they were talking about James Case, and he was engaged in getting settlers to the lake. And some of the things that were in that were last spring, the long lake country, although lying at her very door, was a land unknown to most of us. He's speaking in reference to being a resident of Alpena, and it was 10 to 12 miles north and west of Alpena at the time, and just didn't have transportation to and from the lake. A lot of people just didn't know about the lake. The land was supposed to be valueless. It was nearly all vacant, and that was my reason, this is James Case speaking, for choosing it as my field of operations. It will be enough for settlers to purchase the stripped pine lands when the vacant state and government lands are gone. On my first visit to Long Lake, which was before the snow had all disappeared, a hunter's log cabin was the only human habitation on its shores. So back in 1871, when he first got out to Long Lake, it would strip down. Like I was saying, in the 1870s, a lot of the lumber had been taken. They started selling off some of the property for homesteading and farming, and it was sort of a barren wasteland to a large extent. It wasn't a forest around it at all. Looked quite a bit different than it does now. So James Case was a pioneer, what I would identify as one of the key developers of Long Lake. And of my reading of some of the history around Alpena, I never ran across his name that often. Only when I got involved in something to do with Long Lake did his name start popping up. This is his death notice in one of the Alpena papers after the turn of the century, and it indicated that he was a pioneer that held many county offices. Not so much in this article, it said that he was developing Long Lake, but he did. He was one of the main shakers and movers of getting Long Lake settled. James Case. And unfortunately for James and his family, there isn't much really denoting his contribution. In fact, even his grave at the Evergreen Cemetery out on Highway 32 is unmarked. And you would think somebody who had done an awful lot of developments and bringing people into the county, the northern part of Alpena County, would have some sort of recognition, but evidently not. He has an unmarked grave there at Evergreen Cemetery. So he was one of the shakers and movers, and I think he's been overlooked by history in the area of Alpena. Another person that is more well-known was a gentleman by the name of George Stubbs, and he came to the area in the 1860s, and he set up, in fact, I've got my cursor right here. You can see the orange cursor moving back and forth. He had some land up here by this 1903 map. He had his own resort, the Lakewood Resort. There's George Stubbs, about 114 acres right there. And this is Lakewood Drive. This whole area right here around the lake on the eastern shore was his property. Now, what he had done was he had set up a sawmill. And I'll have to go down here. We'll go down all the way down on the south side, and we'll see right here is his sawmill. So he took a lot of the logs that had come out of the lake in the 1860s and early 1870s, primarily during the Civil War era, and actually set up a sawmill. And his operation was to, cut the lumber and to build up Long Lake to all of the hotels and all of the residences and places of business around the lake as it was being developed. This was his baby, and the sawmill is no longer there, but this is right where US 23 crosses Long Lake Creek. They call it the Narrows. It's due south of Long Lake, and there's nothing much other than just a culvert that you go by. He also had a dam there. So I would say that George Stubbs, in addition to James Case, were two of the main drivers of developing the whole southern end here of Long Lake. I might show you something on this map I found was interesting. This is Little Long Lake right here that is attached to the other lake by, well, now it is by a little creek. That whole lake was developed as nothing more than a clay bed. They dug that out and used the clay for making Portland cement there in Alpena. So that's how that little lake right there was developed. That was a clay deposit that they had taken out. That wasn't a natural lake that was formed there. This part of the lake over here that I'm circling right now is called Somerville. This is where most of the action was in the southwest corner when they first started developing the lake with all of the attractions, and we'll be talking about those in a second. There's his sawmill. This is roughly where US 23 is right now. Looks like that was part of his dam. So it looks a lot different, but from the main lake, which is out here up to the north side of, or the top side of this photograph, the river coming down, and there was a dam constructed there, and also his sawmill. There was another sawmill there. It was more short-lived, but he was in competition with a gentleman by the name of J.D. Turnbull, but George Stubbs was the main developer as far as supplying lumber and materials toward all the building on Long Lake. He was well known. He has a very nice monument there at Evergreen Cemetery, and the Stubbs name is still pretty well ingrained in local history. This here is the entrance, one of the two pillars. The pillars are very similar to the ones they have at Evergreen Cemetery. And this was erected in memory of George Stubbs, who died in 1913. And the entrance to Lakewood Boulevard, which goes along this way here, going out west, says erected in memory of George Stubbs, 1914. He had passed away in 1913. So to my knowledge, this is the only memorial marker to anybody who developed Long Lake, anywhere on the lake. It needs some help. Obviously, we're missing up here, the top cap, we're missing some chinking that goes around there, some concrete. The base is cracked. On the other side of the, which I don't have in this picture, but the other side of it was another entrance marker like this, although it didn't have George's name on it. But that's located right at the entrance to Lakewood Road off of US 23 on the east side. Now we'll get into the Victorian Resort Era, and I'll talk a little bit about where that came from. Queen Victoria, obviously in England. It started out as a movement in England for people to leave London and get out to the country. Hop on a train, get away from the city because it was a lot healthier, be around the fresh air and enjoy the environments of nature out away from the city. And if you think about the era that they lived in, was pretty filthy. The coal smoke was hanging, the smog was hanging thick. A lot of people just felt that it was important. Queen Victoria had several country estates, and it was sort of the thing to do. Well, that had moved over to the United States. And they also had a movement to get away from the cities, get out of Detroit, get out of Chicago, um, go out to the country and enjoy nature for a week, take your family. And people who had done very well for themselves and were making good money had disposable income. So along about 1881, a couple of brothers from Alpena, James and John McDonald, had put together their family money and had decided to build the very first Victorian resort, and it's called the Maple Grove House. Now, the McDonald brothers were sons of Angus MacDonald, who was involved in some of the first commerce during some of the lumbering operations. So the family had some pretty good money, and they'd been in town for quite a few years. The younger McDonald brothers had 16 acres of ground, and it even says in this particular publication here, which is also the history of Lake Huron, that their 16 acres makes an exceedingly pleasant resort from the heat and business of city life. So even people in Alpena, they say, well, come out to the country, you'll really enjoy it. But I think that the main draw, and it proved out to be because there's people from all over Michigan came up to Alpena at one time for the Maple Grove House. And looks like they had a plank walk as a 2-story hotel, a lot of rowboats, sailing boats, and here is an old image of the Maple Grove House. They actually called it by several different names. Maple Grove House is the name of the house on the side of the hotel. You can see it where I'm pointing right here. It says Maple Grove House. They also called it the Hotel Long Lake for a short period of time, but they also called Maple Grove House Somerville Haven. And if you remember the map I showed you just a few back, the blue map, Somerville was located in the very southwest corner of Long Lake. But this was the way it looked, a big long porch. This is a car in the 1920s, so this was probably just kind of past its heyday. 1920s car there. You can see they also had some cottages off to the side. Big long front porch. And for anybody who's been up to Grand Lake, you'll notice that there's a place up there called Fireside Inn, and they have a big long porch just about like this. Now, in 1927, there was a little more to it than just the hotel. They had a casino in the hotel, actually. And in the casino, they had some gambling machines, some cottages, and some various rooms. $20 per week for a person, $37 per week for 2 people. And there were some stories that had come up of the Maple Grove house that they had a raid there one time, and they took one of the gambling machines and had to put it on a boat real quick, took it out to the middle of the lake and dumped it overboard. So that was a kind of a little bit of a note that people had when they were talking about some of the history of the Maple Grove Casino. Right next door to it, they had built another large place that was called the Adrian. The Adrian Hotel wasn't named after anybody in particular. I believe it was named after where some venture capital money had come from Adrian, Michigan. And there were some bankers that had come up and developed several different properties up on Grand Lake. Well, I think they also developed down here in Somerville. They developed beside the Maple Grove house. called the Hotel Adrian, and there was two nice large buildings, two-story again, as you can see. We're talking about people getting out of the city and into the country for their health. And I think you can see that there were some Detroit visitors back in the 20s, the roaring 20s, that had come down. The Goodrich family was one image that I had collected somewhere along the line that had come up the Long Lake and just loved coming up for the Victorian resorts, the roaring 20s, so to speak, the times when things were a little simpler and people had a lot of disposable income. That was part of the Victorian Resort Era. Also in that area, just a little bit south of where the two large hotels were, was a country club, believe it or not. And there was a golf course. There was the Long Lake Country Club. And that was chartered in about 1903. And I could not find some of the original members of the country club, but I'm sure they were the McDonald brothers and some of the major shakers and movers in Alpena had put money up to develop this country club. And they also put in a golf course that is still available to see because the land is flat and there's not a lot of trees growing on it. Right now, if you go out Long Lake Highway, go close to Maple Grove Road, that intersection right there is where the golf course was. And as you can see here by the only picture I could find of the links at the country club, it was pretty well stripped of all trees and they had sand traps and pretty flat ground. It was a par 3 golf course there. So Long Lake, and this is in the early 1900s by this time, had their 2 or 3 major hotels. They had a casino, they had a country club, and they had a golf course all in one area there on the southwest corner of Long Lake. Pretty impressive. Developed pretty quickly. This is the cover of my first book that I did, The Lost Resorts and Cottages of Long Lake, or you might want to call that volume 1. This is actually a postcard of the country club there. It's colorized, and thought it was a very nice indication of what the property looked like. I can tell you that they did make a mistake in this. Those vehicles that you see down here that I'm putting the arrow on right now, those are actually Alpena Flyers. Those are actually vehicles that were manufactured in the town of Alpena, 1911 through 1914, I believe. It was a short-lived car company, as many of them were back in the day before Henry Ford really took over everything. But the reason I know they weren't red is because they only made them in one color. And here is the only surviving Alpena Flyer, and it was a navy blue or a royal blue. And this is displayed in the Besser Museum here in Alpena, and it's really a wonderful vehicle to take a look at if you get a chance. But you can just imagine, though, one of those 2 cars in that picture right there is probably that vehicle that is now in the Besser Museum. So not only did they have their country club and their golf course, but they had their own automobiles. Of course, all good things come to an end, and the problem with the Victorian Resort Era was twofold. It was the First World War, which took a lot of people away from their home to fight in Europe. It was Prohibition, and then afterwards, of course, you have the Great Depression. So things really started slowing down in the 20s, came to a grinding halt in the in 1929, and the Gilded Age was pretty much over with by that particular point in time. Things had to change, and the lake had to change as well. I put together a little movie here. This is the mom and pop cottage era. And I wanted to sort of show what that was about. It's, you know, I could sit here and talk all day about what it was like to stay at a mom and pop resort. A lot of us have, I know I have. But what I did was I had so many images of one mom and pop resort in particular called Tebow Rest. Too many for me to put in volume one or in the book. There's just way too many. So what I did was I put some of those images together in like a little movie. And as you can see, the lakes coming up here. Down here is Somerville, and that's where all the resorts and everything were. Tebow's Rest was across the lake, across the southern end here, right over there. That's called Tebow's Rest. And we'll zoom in on that. That part of the lake was developed in 1922. And Charles Tebow came from Oscoda down south and came up and bought property up here. You can also see Seymour's store right there. Seymour's store started in 1922. Tebow's Rest, right across the street, began in 1923. And here's a look at one of the cards that were sent around once people stayed up there. They sent cards all over the country. There's some of the cards. Notice that it says Lone Lake, Lonelake. That actually was supposed to be Long Lake, but yeah, the guy had written it incorrectly. That's Charles Tebow right there. That was the owner. Some of his guests would come in, and it looks like he caught his limit for sure that day. Some of the pictures of the Tebow Rest in the wintertime they took, and it looks like a late 40s car there. 1927 tourist note. There's Charles Tebow with some of his visitors that probably came up year after year after year. He had a nice dock that went out from the main property. There is actually a house that the cottage that was one of the original Tebow Rest cottages. And Tebow Rest, see where it says Lone Lake? Actually, that's Long Lake. The guy just made his G's backwards. And that's either Mrs. Tebow or one of the campers he put to work while they came up and did fishing. And there's there's a nice dock that he's got there. They all had their boats, and I'm sure if it was like a lot of other resorts, they all had certain colors for their boats. Certain resorts had a red boat or a white boat or white and red and that sort of thing. Charles Daniel Tebow, a little bit of genealogy information on him. There's a family come up. Looks like she's happier about it than he is, but it is a family of four that came up to enjoy the slide back in the 30s and 40s. And looking down the lake a little bit, you can see the trees aren't all that tall, and they are a little bit thin. Now, there was in that one picture of that cottage that I showed you, that was in the wall right there. That was a calendar from 1923. And when they opened the wall up, that calendar was sitting in there. I thought that was an interesting image that someone had sent me. If you look across the street, that is Seymour's store. Now, there's another picture of the dock, a little fuzzy picture there, but that's the dock. There is Seymour's store directly across the street. Actually, Tebow Rest and Seymour's store were pretty close. Seymour's Grocery, you can see it across there. Really help each other out quite a bit. It's interesting to see where some of the mail goes to and comes from. That was a random picture that someone had sent me. He said he went to Tebow Rest in Alpena. And guy by the name of Einar. His name is long lost to history now, I'm sure. Now, when we move from the mom and pop era into the present era, you're really looking at basically people buying it and privatizing it. Let me show you some pictures of before and after. That was Brown's Resort. It's now phasing into what it looks like today. So that was a 1956 picture of Brown's summer cottages, and then a 2020 picture of the same angle, the same building. Here's one that's on the east side of Long Lake that is Siemens Grocery. And this was a local little grocery store on Gutchess Avenue, or Parallel Avenue, I believe. And if you take a look at it now, it's a garage. You'd have no clue that at one time it was a little country store that kids used to run it out for candy year after year after year after year. This one's a little bit easier to identify, but this was a store before they had Long Lake Market on Long Lake Highway. This was called Davy's Store and Cottages, and his Sandy Beach Resort. Well, you'd have no clue that that's what that was, but it's a garage now. And that's sort of right across from where Long Lake Market is. Of course, when Long Lake Market came in, that's what sort of took out the Davies Market. And Davies still does have the Sandy Beach Resort. It's run now, it's still open. It's one of the few here in Long Lake that is still present and available for rental. The books that I did, there's 2 books, 2 volumes. The years that they cover are roughly 140 years. I start off with the Maple Grove era, the Victorian Resort Era, and up into the present time. I take a lot of my own images in there of places that I could identify. I did include some of my old images, even if they were just empty ground now. I tried to take a picture of where these places were. It's 2 volumes. The total number of resorts and cottages in both volumes, I wanted to kind of let you think about here for a second, because I know I probably missed 3 or 4 along the way. 53. So there are 53 places that I was able to identify over 140 years that were some sort of resorts or cottages or some place that people could go, some hospitality place located on the lake that have impacted people's lives for decades and generations. For example, people, grandparents used to take them up here. Well, those people came up here and maybe they even bought property up here. So there are about 200 color photographs. One thing I didn't want to do is I wanted to make it to where the photographs were interesting, and in some cases, like the colorized images, I wanted to bring those colors out. And each volume has about 200 photographs, even though some of the photographs are obviously in black and white. It's a 8 by 12. You can get it in either a hard or soft binding or soft cover. And to my knowledge, it's the first books of its kind about Long Lake. There's nobody that has put together a visual history of Long Lake with some text about the names of the people who started the resorts, what years they were roughly, a little genealogy information about the people, are they buried in the local area? Where did they go after they left Long Lake? All that. That's all included in the books. Obviously, most Long Lake resorts, cottages, and the old timers are long gone. The book is really dedicated to the memory. This is what the book looks like on internal layout. Dannelly's cottages are there on the left-hand side. And you've got the Davies Sandy Beach Resort there on the right. And it tells a little bit about Dannelly, a picture of him, some of his guests up there, some of very rare pictures of him building his place. And like I say, there's 53 different locales that are covered in those 2 volumes. But the reason I did this book to begin with is I realized that historic preservation, there really wasn't an opportunity to do much of that. because most of the buildings, most of the places, and obviously the people are gone. So how do you do historic preservation and keep the memory alive of something that was once very, very vibrant? And I did that with a book. And you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I prefer to do it more visually as opposed to having a lot of text. There's a lot of times people can sit around and they can add their own text because they'll remember some of these places, and they'll sit around the campfire, or they'll sit around a coffee table and talk about, you know, what they remember growing up and seeing on Long Lake. That's sort of my purpose in putting the books together. Here is a listing of all 53 of the places. If you take a look, Beck Grand Hotel, that's John Beck. He was a brewer in that's number 3 there. He was a brewer in Alpena that wound up buying 3 different places. He bought 2 from somebody on Long Lake, the 2 large Victorian resorts. Those both burnt. Then he built his own, and it burnt. And so he had 3 places that he was burned out of by 1917. He was either a very unlucky person or something else was going on, but John Beck was a character for sure. Brown's Summer Cottages, Burton's Colonial Village. Now, Ann Burton is still living, and her husband Ted and her put that together in the late 50s. Dannelly's, Davies were from they were from Ohio. A lot of people from Ohio, as a matter of fact. DeLong's Cottages, local people. Fetro's, they were from Ohio as well. Genshaw's, Gibson's, Hannah's, Heckendorn's, they were from, Heckendorn was a grocer from Massillon, Ohio. There was people that was always telling me they had so many people from Ohio used to come up the Long Lake. Well, a lot of the people came from Ohio and put places of their own up at Long Lake in Michigan. Very strange, isn't it? But if you think about it, Ohio, where do they go north? Not into Lake Erie. They got to have to go somewhere. So they have to come around the Horn and come up to Alpena. Lewandowski's, Jerglers, Rossi, Showalters, a lot of family names that are still probably family is still here in the Long Lake area, no doubt about it. This was a typical scanning party that I did when I got people. They say, oh, I've got all sorts of pictures, but I don't know how to get them to you. Some people did get them to me. They took pictures of them on their table and emailed them to me, or they would bring me pictures that I would go visit them, and I would do a flatbed scanner. So this was a setup that I would do. This was one of my scanning parties as I was putting the book together. If you look over here on the right-hand side, it says Grand Lakes Vintage Resorts. That's that book by Janet, black and white book by Janet Young, that I had used to sort of inspire me to do something for Long Lake. When I got the images, you know, I was telling you about how I would, sometimes they would just put them on a table and just take a picture with their phone. That's what this picture is on the left, and that's very faded. So what I would have to do is I did a digital restoration. I'd been doing those type of things for quite a few years with the type of work that I used to do. So I'd restore them. I'd restore the contrast, you know, sharpen them up, resize them, get them into something that is usable. And you can see a lot more resolution in the items. All back in here, you can see part of the boat. Couldn't see it before. You can see his face clearly. And so I did a lot of that. I just didn't take the images as I got them. I did try to do some restoration and enhancement whenever possible, well, without changing the nature of the subject. And I'm always available for questions and comments. I did do a 2-part series. The second, or a 2-volume set, the second volume is just now being delivered, and it is for sale. The first volume is sold at Parallel 45 bookstore softcover version. If you wanted to order the hardcover version, it's at longlakebook.com. You can also contact me there and send me any questions or comments. But the volume 2 book is just now being delivered to people, and I've been getting some very good results. People really like the second and final addition to the 2-volume set for the Lost Resorts and Cottages of Long Lake. And if you have any questions or any comments, anything that you would like to get a hold of me at, please visit my website at longlakebook.com. Okay, how's that, Judy?
That was great.